at the southern edge of ancient Jerusalem, where the ground falls away into a rough ravine. The first light of morning would have touched stone, ash, and broken earth before it reached the rooftops of the city. That valley later carried a name people would never hear without a shudder: Hinnom. How does a place so close to the holy city become a byword for judgment? How does a people who knew the law of Moses come near a fire the law called unthinkable? The Bible speaks of a worship so offensive that it is named again and again, not as an obscure foreign rite beyond Israel's horizon, but as a real temptation at Israel's doorstep and at times inside Israel's own life. The name is usually given in English as Molech or Moloch. In some passages the wording is debated. Scholars still discuss whether certain texts point to a deity, a type of vow, or a sacrificial term linked to royal offerings. But the force of the biblical witness is not in doubt. Children were being passed through the fire. The prophets looked at it and found no noble meaning hidden beneath it, no deeper symbolism to soften it. They called it defilement. They called it apostasy. They called it blood. To understand why the subject carries such weight, we have to begin where the Bible begins, with a people whose entire identity rested on a covenant. Israel not merely worship a national god alongside others. At least in the faith taught by its law, Israel belonged to the Lord alone. That exclusiveness was the point. Their festivals, food laws, sacrifices, kingship, land and calendar all formed one world. A world ordered around a God who had brought slaves out of Egypt and claimed them as his own. In that world, children were not raw material for religious bargaining. They were inheritance, promise, memory, and future. That is why the law speaks with such absolute force. In Leviticus 18 and 20, the prohibition appears among the practices that mark the surrounding nations, and that Israel was never to imitate. The offense is framed not only as moral evil but as profanation. It violates the name of God. It contaminates the land. It tears a hole in the covenant order itself. Deuteronomy is equally severe. Israel is told not to learn the detestable ways of the nations, for even their sons and daughters they burn in the fire to their gods. The horror is not incidental, it is central. Yet the most unsettling part of the story is that this was not merely a warning against somebody else's religion. Scripture records that kings of Judah, heirs of David, men ruling within sight of the temple, crossed that line. The danger was never simply the existence of foreign gods. The danger was the slow persuasion that devotion to the Lord could be mixed with other loyalties, other fears, other bargains. That is how the Bible tells the story of idolatry. It does not usually arrive as an open declaration that truth is false and falsehood is true. It arrives as accommodation, as political convenience, as affection, as fear for the future, as the hope that one more altar might secure one more blessing. The world around Israel made those bargains feel normal. The ancient Near East was crowded with sanctuaries, local gods, territorial powers, and ritual obligations. People sought rain, fertile fields, healthy flocks, childbirth, military success, and heirs to continue the house. In many cultures, religion and survival were tightly bound together. If crops failed, if enemies advanced, if disease spread through a household, people did not separate economics, politics, warfare, and worship into neat categories. They asked which divine power had been neglected, offended, or not yet persuaded. That helps explain the pressure. It does not excuse it. The Bible never excuses it. But it does remind us that idolatry fed on real anxieties. It preyed on parents who feared famine, rulers who feared invasion, nobles who feared instability, and households who feared the silence of barren years. A God who claimed to guarantee protection or prosperity could seem powerful precisely because the price was so terrible. Costly rites often feel convincing to frightened people. If the sacrifice hurts, people tell themselves it must work. If the act is unbearable, they tell themselves it must prove devotion. The logic is ancient. and it is cruel. So the story of Moloch is not just the story of an alien cult with grotesque rites. It is the story of how covenant faith met a world of fear, ambition, and compromise. It is the story of a valley near Jerusalem, of kings who forgot what kind of God they served, of prophets who would not stop speaking, and of a people forced to learn that some bargains destroy the very thing they promised to save. Before we reach Solomon, or Josiah, or the prophet standing over the smoke of Judah's sins, we have to ask a simpler question. Who or what was Moloch in the first place? And why did that name become a permanent sign of shame? Chapter 2. The name itself carries a history of dispute, and that dispute matters, because it shows how fiercely the tradition wanted to strip this power of dignity. In Hebrew, the root behind the word is closely related to Melech, king. That much is plain. But many scholars have long noted that the vocalization behind Melech may reflect something deliberate and contemptuous. The consonants of king appear to be combined with the vowels of bosheth, shame, producing something like a mock title, a way of saying not the true king, but a false king marked by disgrace. It is the language of rejection. Even in pronunciation, the worship is treated as polluted. The problem is that the biblical texts do not always use the term in the same way. Sometimes English translations render it as a proper name, Molech. In other places, the context overlaps with Milcom, the god associated with the Ammonites. Elsewhere, scholars wonder whether the word could refer not only to a deity, but to a type of sacrifice or a ritual category, known more broadly across Semitic cultures. Ancient religion does not always hand modern readers clean labels. Gods overlapped, titles shifted, local forms blended with imperial influence. A people might honor one divine figure under several names, or several figures under titles that sounded alike. Even so, the broad setting is not hard to trace. East of the Jordan lived the Ammonites, descendants in Israel's memory from the line of Lot, sometimes neighbors, sometimes enemies, often rivals. Their national god is usually named Milcom in the Hebrew Bible, yet the orbit of Molech touches the same world. Beyond Ammon lay the larger religious landscape of Canaan and Phoenicia, where Baal, Ashtoreth, El and other deities formed a crowded system of power, fertility, kingship, storm and war. These were not abstract ideas. They were woven into statecraft, family alliances, agricultural hope, and public ritual. That is why the Bible's polemic against Molech is not merely a personal moral warning. It is also a challenge to surrounding systems of authority. The title king was never innocent in the ancient world, ruled by divine favor. Temples affirmed royal order. Fertility of land and stability of throne belonged to the same symbolic universe. To serve the wrong king in worship was ultimately to place oneself under the wrong order of reality. Moloch, in that sense, stands for a rival sovereignty. The cult did not simply ask for a ceremony. It demanded transfer of allegiance. Later Greek and Roman writers describe Phoenician and Punic practices that seem related, especially in Carthage, the great North African city founded by Phoenician settlers. Their accounts speak of children offered in times of crisis, of elites giving what was dearest to secure divine aid. These texts must be handled carefully. Ancient enemies often exaggerated the crimes of rival peoples. Greek and Roman authors were capable of moral theater, and they were not neutral observers of Carthage. Yet archaeology has complicated any attempt to dismiss the reports entirely. Excavations at Carthaginian Tophets, burial precincts filled with urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young animals, have kept the debate alive. Some scholars argue these remains reflect ordinary child burial in a sacred place. Others see strong evidence of sacrificial practice, at least in some cases. The argument remains active, but the old certainty that the stories were pure slander is harder to sustain. The Bible, however, does not depend on Carthage for its case. Long before modern archaeology, its own concern was local and moral. It speaks of an offering to Moloch, of making sons and daughters pass through fire, of high places in the valley of Ben Hinnom, of kings who embraced what the covenant forbade. Whether every detail of later artistic description can be verified is secondary. The central fact in the biblical imagination is that devotion to this power inverted the order of love. It turned the vulnerable into payment. That inversion helps explain why the tradition remembered Moloch not just as one deity among many, but as a kind of anti-king. In Israel's faith, a king existed to protect the people, defend the weak, establish justice, and keep covenant. This rival king consumed the future of his own worshippers. He gave nothing without demanding blood. He promised security by asking parents to violate the most basic trust placed in their hands. That is why biblical writers do not treat the practice as a strange eccentricity. They treat it as rebellion at the deepest level, the enthronement of a lie. There is also a social truth here. Such worship could never have survived on private madness alone. It required priests, customs, places, stories, and shared pressure. A father or mother does not move toward an altar like that in a cultural vacuum. There must be voices saying, "This is necessary, this is noble, this is proven, this is what responsible people do when the future is at stake." The cult of Moloch, whatever its exact forms in each place, belonged to that terrifying class of religious systems that turn communal fear into sacred duty, and so the name remains fitting. King, perhaps. Shame, certainly. A counterfeit sovereignty dressed in the language of necessity. A ruler whose throne was built not on justice but on panic. To see how the Bible answered him, we have to descend from names and titles to places, fires, and texts. We have to look at the valley itself, at the meaning of Topheth, and at what can be known, what can only be inferred, and why the memory of that ground lasted far beyond the age of Judah's kings. Chapter 3. Southwest of ancient Jerusalem. The land breaks into ridges and ravines. The city was never an isolated monument floating above history. It sat in hard country, defended by slopes and valleys, dependent on water, traders, armies, and ideas. One of the ravines skirting the city became known as the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, or Ben Hinnom. In Hebrew memory and later Jewish speech, that name gathered moral weight until it became more than geography. But before it became a symbol, it was a real place outside the walls, near enough to matter, far enough to hide disgrace in plain sight. Several biblical texts tie child sacrifice to this valley. 2 Kings speaks of Topheth, in the valley of the children of Hinnom. Jeremiah denounces the building of high places there, where sons and daughters were burned in the fire, and insists with startling force that such a thing had not been commanded by God, nor had it entered his mind. That sentence matters. It is not a casual prohibition. It is a theological boundary marker. The prophet is saying that this ritual does not belong to some darker layer of biblical faith. It is not a misunderstood form of true worship. It stands outside the character of Israel's God altogether. Topheth is itself a difficult word. Some connect it with a hearth or fireplace. Others think it may relate to drumming, perhaps from a root linked with percussion, though that is far from certain. Later tradition loved the image of drums beating loudly to drown out the cries of children. The detail has endured because it captures the emotional logic of the rite, even if the textual basis for the drums is not as direct as popular retellings sometimes suggest. Here, caution matters. The Bible clearly condemns the burning of children. It clearly locates it in the Hinnom Valley. It does not spend much time describing the mechanics. Later Jewish commentary, medieval imagination, and modern sermons often fill the scene with bronze statues, outstretched arms, furnace chamber, and relentless music. Some of these details may preserve old memories or analogies from related cults. Some may be embellishments. Historical honesty means knowing the difference between what the text says and what later tradition paints around it. Still, even the bare biblical statements are enough to explain the valley's reputation. A site near the holy city, associated with forbidden fire, innocent blood, and royal apostasy would not remain morally neutral in memory. Over time, the Hebrew Gehinnom becomes the Greek Gehenna, a term used in later Jewish literature and in the Gospels as an image of final judgment. That development was not accidental. A place once linked with covenant betrayal and burned offerings became a fitting emblem for ruin under divine justice. Hell language did not descend from mythology without roots. It grew, in part, from Israel's historical scars. Archaeology around Jerusalem has not produced a single dramatic object that settles every modern question about Moloch worship. History is rarely that tidy. What it does offer is context. Excavations confirm the complex ritual life of Judah, the existence of high places, household cult objects, inscriptions invoking multiple divine names, and repeated signs that official faith and popular religion were often not the same. The Bible's complaint that Judah mixed loyalties is not hard to believe once the material world of the Iron Age comes into view. People did not live inside pure theological systems. They lived with shrines, amulets, local priests, family customs, regional influences, and political pressures. That broader evidence makes the prophetic accusations more plausible, not less. When Jeremiah or Ezekiel denounce the shedding of innocent blood and the making of offerings in forbidden places, they are not speaking into a vacuum. They are confronting a society where religious improvisation had become normal and where royal power sometimes legitimized what the law condemned. In such a world, the Valley of Hinnom was not simply a criminal site beyond the city's concern. It was a mirror of what the city had become willing to tolerate. One reason the memory endures is that the valley stands at the intersection of worship and state power. These were not merely desperate private acts hidden in caves. The biblical texts place them in the orbit of kings. When royal patronage, elite imitation, and cult practice combine, evil hardens into public order. That may be why later reform had to be equally public. To defile Topheth, as Josiah later did, was not only to destroy a shrine. It was to proclaim that this entire moral arrangement had lost legitimacies. So the valley's afterlife in language is not arbitrary. Gehenna becomes a symbol because Hinnom had already become a wound. It was a place where covenant and cruelty collided, a place where the closeness to the temple only deepened the scandal, a place where the future of families could be offered in the name of securing the future of the nation. That contradiction is what makes the story unbearable. The rites were not committed by people who hated blessing. They were committed by people who wanted blessing badly enough to betray the giver of life. That leads to the question the texts force on every reader. Why would anyone do this? Not in the abstract. Not with easy contempt. Why would fathers, mothers, priests, and kings move toward a rite so terrible? The answer lies not only in wickedness, though wickedness is present. It lies in fear, scarcity, ambition, imitation, and the old human temptation to believe that if the stakes are high enough, no sacrifice is too great. Chapter 4a Society does not arrive at child sacrifice by a single leap. It gets there through a chain of arguments, each one made under pressure, each one presented as realism. The harvest has failed before. Armies have crossed these roads before. Infant mortality is common. Disease moves quickly. Dynasties are fragile. A king without an heir is a weak king. A field without rain is a dead field. In a world like that, religion becomes charged with urgency. People do not ask only what is beautiful or true. They ask what will work. That is one reason the cult of Moloch, or rites associated with that name, could appear persuasive. The offering of something precious is emotionally powerful. It feels weighty, final, binding. If the gift hurts, then it proves sincerity. If the price is beyond bearing, it can be framed as ultimate devotion. Ancient religions often assumed exchange. Sacrifice secures favor, averts wrath, or compels attention from the divine realm. Israel's own sacrificial system also operated through offering, atonement, and gift, but with a crucial difference. In the law of Moses, sacrifice never authorized the destruction of children as fuel for blessing. The life of the covenant community was to be sustained, not consumed. The psychological trap is not hard to see. A parent who fears losing everything can be persuaded that the unthinkable must be done precisely because it is unthinkable. Priests can say the gods are asking for what costs most. Rulers can say the nation is in danger. Nobles can say this is what neighboring powers do when crisis comes. And once a ritual is old enough, it no longer feels like invention. It feels like tradition. That gives it legitimacy. People obey not because they have reasoned through every step, but because ancestors did it, authorities bless it, and fear makes dissent feel irresponsible. The Bible understands this social power. Again and again, idolatry in Scripture is bound to imitation of the nations. The phrase is more than ethnic rivalry. It describes the borrowing of whole patterns of life. Israel wanted vineyards, cities, security, dynastic continuity, diplomatic marriages, trade routes, and military alliances. Those goals were not always wrong in themselves. The danger came when the methods used to secure them were imported along with the goals. A shrine can travel with a marriage treaty. A ritual can travel with merchants. A god can arrive not with an army, but with prestige. This is where the story becomes more than horror and becomes diagnosis. Moloch worship, as the Bible portrays it, feeds on two forces that still govern human behavior: desire for gain and fear of loss. Give up this and you will prosper. Refuse and you may lose everything. That is a powerful formula. It turns conscience into a luxury item. It teaches people to call destruction wisdom. And because the promised goods are often good things in distorted form, safety, rain, children, peace, status, the false worship does not always feel openly wicked at first. It feels practical. For rulers, the temptation is sharper. A king's failures are public. When borders tremble or famine threatens, symbolic action matters. Public rites reassure people that the throne is doing something. A severe offering can project seriousness. In that sense, Moloch worship is political theater as much as personal religion. It dramatizes control in the face of chaos. The king cannot command the weather, but he can command an altar. He cannot guarantee victory, but he can show the nation that no cost will be spared to seek divine help. It is a brutal parody of leadership. The prophets see through this. Jeremiah does not treat such rites as tragic but understandable emergency measures. He calls them rebellion because they require the suppression of the basic knowledge of God. Israel already had a history. The Exodus, Sinai, the wilderness, the land, the law, the temple, these were not neutral memories. They testified that the Lord had already shown what kind of God he was. To turn to Moloch was not merely to seek help elsewhere. It was to declare that the covenant God could not be trusted. That blessing had to be secured by another logic, a harsher king, a more violent exchange. And that is why children stand at the center of the offense. In biblical thought, a child is not only beloved, a child is also a sign that the future belongs ultimately to God. Israel's story begins with barren wombs opened by promise, with sons born under threat, with families preserved through famine, slavery, exile, and war. To place a child in the fire is therefore more than murder. It is a sacramental rejection of trust. It says, in effect, the future is ours to purchase by any means necessary. It says blessing can be manufactured by destruction. Once that logic takes hold, nothing stays contained. A people that learns to sacrifice its future for immediate security will do the same in other forms. Justice can be abandoned for order. Truth can be traded for influence. The poor can be exploited for royal projects. The vulnerable can be hidden beneath the noise of public necessity. That is why the biblical attack on Moloch belongs with its attack on idolatry, oppression, and bloodshed more broadly. These sins are not isolated. They spring from the same refusal to trust the Lord's order of life. So when the story turns towards Solomon, the shock is not only that a wise king tolerated foreign worship. It is that the man who built the temple also opened a door to a rival logic of power. The issue is not that Solomon suddenly became a barbarian in a single moment. The issue is that affection, politics, and prestige gradually taught him to make room for altars that Israel's law had never allowed. The road to Hinnom did not begin in the valley. It began in the heart and in the palace. Chapter 5, Solomon enters the biblical record as a figure almost luminous with promise. He is David's son, the builder of the temple, the king whose wisdom draws visitors from distant lands, the ruler under whom Israel reaches unusual stability and wealth. First Kings lingers over the splendor of his court, the ordering of his administration, the magnificence of the house he builds for the Lord, the breadth of his understanding. If any king seemed fortified against folly, it was Solomon. That is precisely why his fall matters. Scripture does not present it as an accident of ignorance. Solomon knew the covenant tradition. He prayed at the dedication of the temple. He asked for wisdom and received it. Yet the same narrative that praises his discernment also records his many foreign marriages. These marriages were not simple private romances. In the ancient world, royal marriages were political instruments. They secured alliances, stabilized borders, opened trade, and projected prestige. Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite wives. The list in 1 Kings 11 is not gossip. It is geopolitics written into family structure. The law had warned Israel's king about accumulation. Not too many horses, not too much silver and gold, not too many wives, lest his heart turn away. The warning is exact because the pressure is exact. Every new alliance creates a new obligation. Every royal household from abroad carries language, servants, customs, memories, and gods. Solomon may have imagined he could manage all of it, incorporate all of it, remain sovereign over all of it. That is often how wisdom fails, not by ceasing to be intelligent, but by overestimating its immunity. The text says his wives turned away his heart after other gods when he was old. That does not mean the corruption arrived only at the end like a sudden storm. It suggests a long process that finally hardened into pattern. Altars are not built in a day unless permission for them has already been granted somewhere deeper. A king who begins by tolerating another shrine for diplomatic peace may eventually kneel where he once merely allowed others to kneel. Compromise ripens slowly, then all at once appears obvious. Among the shrines Solomon built was one for Milcom or Moloch, associated with the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem, likely the ridge later called the Mount of Olives. The location is devastating in its symbolism. Across the valley from the temple of the Lord stood high places for rival gods. The contradiction was visible in stone. The city of David, center of covenant memory, had become a city of divided worship. What should have been unthinkable was now normalized at the highest level. Here the biblical narrative is psychologically precise. It does not portray Solomon as a man who woke one morning and decided truth no longer mattered. It portrays a man whose loves became disordered. The problem is not that he cared for people from other nations. Israel's own story had room for foreigners who came under the Lord's wings. The problem is that political affection and royal appetite overcame covenant fidelity. His heart was not merely broadened, it was divided. In biblical language, that is fatal. A divided heart is more dangerous than an openly hostile one, because it can preserve religious language while emptying obedience. Solomon did not tear down the temple. He did not renounce the Lord in a formal decree, he added. He accommodated. He made room. That is the shape of much biblical idolatry. The rival altar often appears beside the true one before it tries to replace it. People tell themselves that coexistence is harmless, that a small concession can be contained, that reverence for God can survive a few strategic exceptions. Scripture's judgment on Solomon is that it could not. The consequences are political as well as spiritual. The Lord announces that the kingdom will be torn, though not fully in Solomon's lifetime for David's sake. The fracture that later divides Israel and Judah is not explained only by taxation, labor policies, or succession tensions, though those matter in the historical story. The biblical text insists that idolatry sits near the center of the disaster. A kingdom built by wisdom can still break if the wisdom that built it no longer knows how to bow. Solomon's story matters because it ruins easy confidence. If the builder of the temple can sanction the very worship the law abhors, then privilege does not protect anyone. Knowledge does not protect anyone by itself. Experience, success, even answered prayer do not make a person invulnerable. A heart can become skilled in governing others while failing to govern itself. The king who could judge between disputing mothers in his youth could, in his age, help build a religious world in which children were no longer safe. This is where the biblical narrative becomes more than royal biography. Solomon stands as a warning about the intimacy between greatness and compromise. The more secure people feel in their gifts, the more likely they are to believe they can carry disobedience without collapse. But no one builds an altar to Moloch in a single afternoon. The shrine is prepared by 100 earlier permissions, by the quiet decision that obedience can be edited when love, fear, or power asks for an exception. And once the king has made room for such a king of shame, the nation will pay for it long after his own voice is gone. Chapter 6. After Solomon, the kingdom does not simply decline in one straight line, but the fracture is real. The united monarchy breaks. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah walk separate political paths, though both remain haunted the same spiritual disease. Altars multiply, high places persist, dynasties rise and fall. Assyria expands, Aram Presi, Egypt still matters. Small states learn to survive between empires. In such a world, fidelity becomes expensive. The biblical writers measure kings not only by military or economic success, but by worship. Did they remove the high places? Did they walk in the ways of David? Did they provoke the Lord with idols? Those are covenant questions, and they shape the memory of the monarchy. Against that background, the return of child sacrifice in Judah is not treated as a random atrocity. It is the fruit of a deeper surrender. Ahaz, king of Judah in the 8th century before Christ, rules in fear. The Syro-Ephraimite crisis threatens Jerusalem. Isaiah meets him with a word of trust and a sign from God, but Ahaz prefers calculation. He appeals to Assyria, reshapes worship in Judah after what he sees in Damascus. And the books of Kings and Chronicles say that he made his son pass through the fire. That phrase is brief, but its brevity makes it heavier. The biblical text does not linger over spectacle. It records the act as one more sign that a king under pressure chose the logic of the nations rather than the God who had offered faithfulness. Then comes Manasseh, and with him the darkness deepens. He is the son of Hezekiah, the reforming king who had trusted God in the face of Assyria. The contrast is painful. 2 Kings 21 says Manasseh rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed, erected altars to Baal, made an Asherah, worshipped the host of heaven, built altars in the house of the Lord, practiced divination, and made his son pass through the fire. The text adds that he shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. This is not private syncretism. It is public corruption saturating the city. Why does Manasseh matter so much in biblical memory? Partly because his reign was long. A long reign can normalize almost anything. Children grow up assuming the current order is ordinary. Priests adapt. Nobles profit. People learn how to speak around evil rather than against it. By the time reform finally comes, wrong can feel ancestral. That is why later tradition treats Manasseh as a turning point, a king whose sins accelerated judgment over Judah. Whether every later assessment is shaped by theological hindsight is beside the point. The biblical writers want readers to see that entrenched idolatry is not just a series of bad choices. It is a pedagogy. It teaches a nation how to stop flinching. The prophets answer that numbness with furious clarity. Jeremiah speaks of the valley of Hinnom and the building of high places to burn sons and daughters, and he insists that the place will no longer be called Topheth but the valley of slaughter. Ezekiel from exile traces Judah's unfaithfulness in images so sharp they still disturb. He links idolatry, bloodshed, and the handing over of children in one indictment. The point is theological, but it is also moral and political. A society that sacrifices children while speaking the language of religion has reached a depth of self-deception that only judgment seems able to expose. One detail in Jeremiah is especially important. God says of these rites, "Which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind." That sentence protects the whole biblical story from a terrible misunderstanding. Israel's faith, with its sacrifices, its holy war traditions, its stern judgments, can be hard for modern readers. But here the text draws a bright line. The God of Israel is not one more Near Eastern deity demanding children for favor. The prophets refuse that confusion completely. Whatever other nations worship, Israel's God is the one who brought life out of bondage, not the one who asks parents to purchase blessing with the lives of their sons and daughters. By this point, the issue is no longer only a shrine or a valley. It is a moral order eating itself. Kings who seek security by imitation end by hollowing out the very people they claim to protect. Priests and officials who tolerate such worship help train the nation in the opposite of covenant love. The poor, the young, and the voiceless always suffer most when power learns to call sacrifice wisdom. Yet the biblical story does not end there, because judgment in Scripture is often paired with the possibility of return. The same city that witnessed these abominations would also witness a king determined to cleanse them. The same valley that became a symbol of disgrace would become the site of a public rejection. If Solomon shows how compromise enters, and Manasseh shows how it hardens into order, Josiah shows what it means to tear that order down. Chapter 7, comes to the throne as a child in a damaged kingdom. Assyria, once overwhelming, is weakening. Old structures are shifting. Judah is small, vulnerable, and full of inherited ruin. Yet the biblical account presents Josiah not first as a strategist, but as a reformer whose turning point comes when the book of the law is found in the temple and read aloud. However scholars identify that book, whether an early form of Deuteronomy or a larger legal tradition, the narrative meaning is clear. The nation hears again what it had forgotten. Law exposes memory, memory exposes guilt. Josiah's reaction is not cosmetic. He tears his clothes. He recognizes that Judah has not drifted slightly from covenant, it has broken it. Reform, therefore, cannot remain symbolic. It must strike the places where disobedience had become visible and organized. 2 Kings 23 reads like a map of desecrated worship reversed by force. Vessels are removed from the temple, idolatrous priests are deposed, high places are torn down, rural shrines are crushed, bones are burned on altars. The reform is relentless because the corruption had been deep. Among the most significant acts is Josiah's treatment of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom. The text says he defiled it so that no one might make a son or daughter pass through the fire to Moloch. This is one of those moments where public action matters as theology. A cult site does not lose power merely because someone disapproves of it in private. It loses power when the structures that sustained it are profaned, dismantled, and made unusable. Josiah does not negotiate with Topheth. He renders it unfit for worship. That matters because evil often depends on sacred prestige. So long as a place feels holy, its crimes can be reframed as duty. To defile such a place is to strip the lie of its religious aura. The valley that had absorbed tears and smoke becomes, under reform, a witness against its own former purpose. In effect, Josiah says to Judah, "This will not be one option among many. This will be treated as corruption." His reform also reveals something about repentance in biblical history. Return is not mere emotion, it is concrete. Idols are removed, places are renamed, priests are displaced, practices are forbidden. The Passover is restored. Memory is reordered around covenant again. None of this means Josiah creates a perfect age or permanently heals Judah. The prophets make clear that the consequences of long rebellion are not erased overnight. But his reign proves that even after generations of corruption, reform is possible, and that hope is never served by pretending evil was not evil. The valley's later meaning grows from this history. Once associated with fire, blood, and the desecration of children, Hinnom became a natural image for ruin and judgment. By the time of later Jewish writings and the New Testament, Gehenna had become language for the fate of persistent wickedness under divine sentence. The metaphor worked because the historical memory was already there. People knew what that valley represented. It was a place where a society revealed what it was willing to do to secure itself. To invoke Gehenna was to invoke more than pain. It was to invoke moral exposure. Josiah's story, then, is not merely a bright interlude after Dark Kings. It is a theological answer to Moloch. The answer is not that the old rites were secretly useful if practiced carefully. The answer is not that they belonged to another era. The answer is that they were defilement from the start and had to be overthrown. Reform begins when the nation agrees again about what cannot be normalized. There is also a quieter lesson in the timing. Josiah acts after hearing the law. That means memory precedes cleansing. A people cannot return from a false worship it no longer recognizes as false. It must be told again of is and what kind of life belongs to him. Only then can the altars be judged for what they are. Yet even Josiah's zeal cannot carry the whole burden of the story. A king may destroy Topheth, but he cannot by decree repair every heart. The deeper question remains: what kind of God stands over against Moloch? What does the Bible finally set in contrast to a false king who feeds on the future of his people? The last answer lies not only in reform, but in the character of the Lord himself. Chapter 8. At the center of the biblical rejection of Moloch is not only a prohibition, but a revelation. Israel's God is not merely stronger than rival gods, or more moral than neighboring cults in a general sense. He is different in kind. He is the God who hears the cry of slaves, who binds himself by covenant, who commands justice for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, who teaches Israel to remember its own vulnerability, and who marks life as holy because it is his gift. That is why child sacrifice is not just another sin on a long list. It is a direct contradiction of the divine character as the Bible presents it. The contrast sharpens when we notice the direction of sacrifice. Moloch, in biblical memory, represents a god to whom human beings surrender their children in order to secure favor, safety, or gain. The false king devours the future of his worshippers and calls it devotion. The biblical story moves in the opposite direction. God provides. God rescues. God gives law to restrain violence, not license it. Even when sacrifice remains central to Israel's worship, it remains bounded, regulated, and symbolically ordered toward atonement and thanksgiving, never toward the ritual destruction of sons and daughters for divine manipulation. That is why the story of Abraham and Isaac has to be heard carefully in this context. However difficult that narrative remains, its climax matters. The child is not taken, the knife is stayed, a ram is provided, whatever else the passage says. In the larger biblical canon, it does not authorize Israel to imitate the nations in sacrificing children. On the contrary, the Torah later forbids it with relentless clarity. The God of Israel tests, commands, judges, and saves. But he is not Moloch. The prophets press that distinction because Judah kept forgetting it. When Jeremiah says such rites had never entered God's mind, he is defending not only law but identity. Worship shapes what people think God is like. If they imagine him as one who can be bought with bloodshed, they will treat one another accordingly. If they know him as the one who gives life and demands mercy, justice, and covenant love, then their social world must change as well. Theology is never only about heaven. It decides what sort of city can exist on earth. That is part of why the legacy of Moloch has outlived the ancient shrine. The bronze image, if there was one in any given place, is gone. The high places are dust. The kings who sponsored them lie in silence. But the principle remains recognizable whenever a culture learns to sacrifice what is most precious in order to preserve power, comfort, reputation, or success. Not every analogy is equal. Historical honesty forbids easy slogans, yet the pattern is real. People still silence conscience with noise. They still tell themselves that necessary losses are noble losses, that private devastation is justified by public gain, that the future can be secured by consuming the vulnerable. The old biblical warning is therefore not antiquarian, it is diagnostic. The question is not whether modern people bow before a visible statue in the valley of Hinnom. The question is what kind of bargains they are prepared to make, and whom those bargains require them to place at risk. Families can be sacrificed to ambition. Integrity can be sacrificed to advancement. Truth can be sacrificed to tribe. The weak can be sacrificed to the illusion of order. None of these are identical to the rites of Topheth, and they should not be flattened into one vague metaphor, but they do reveal the same spiritual grammar. The future must burn so the present may feel secure. The biblical answer remains the same. Return begins by naming the false king. It continues by refusing the lie that blessing can be purchased through destruction. It deepens when people remember who truly rules, who gives life, and who alone deserves worship. Solomon's story warns that brilliance cannot save a divided heart. Ahaz and Manasseh warn that fear and habit can make evil feel ordinary. Josiah proves that corruption can be confronted, shrines can be broken, and memory can be restored. The prophets insist that God has not gone silent, while blood cries from the ground, and the valley itself remains in the background of all of it. A narrow wound near Jerusalem, a geography turned into theology. There, more than almost anywhere, the Bible forces a choice between two visions of rule. One king takes life and calls it the price of blessing. The other gives commandments so that life may flourish, rebukes his people when they forget, and refuses to let cruelty pass for worship. That is why the story of Moloch still matters. Not because it invites morbid fascination with ancient horror, but because it reveals how close civilization can stand to sanctified destruction while still using the language of duty, prosperity, and care. The smoke over Hinnom has long since thinned into memory, but the warning remains as sharp as ever. A people becomes like what it worships, and no king of shame, however persuasive, is worth the cost of a child, a conscience, or a soul.